أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Surah 4,
النساء.
Medinan period, period of revelation. This surah comprises a number of discourses revealed between the later part of 3 after Hijri through to the end of 4 after Hijri, and possibly even the early part of 5 after Hijri. It is hard to determine precisely which verses belong to which discourse, just as it is difficult to fix the exact period of the revelation of those verses. Several of these verses, however, contain allusions to certain injunctions and events the dates of which can be ascertained with the help of traditions. On this basis, we can broadly divide the surah into a number of discourses. We know, for example, that the injunctions relating to inheritance and to the protection of the rights of orphans were revealed after the Battle of Uhud, in which 70 Muslims were martyred. The result of this was that the small town of Medina was faced with the problem of distributing inheritance and safeguarding the rights and interests of the orphans left behind by the martyrs. We can thus infer that verses 1 to 28 were revealed during this period. Traditions mention Salat al-Khawf, prayer in the state of insecurity, in connection with the battle of
ذات الرقة,
which took place in 4 after Hijri. So the section which contains directives regarding this prayer must have been revealed around this time. Likewise, we know that the expulsion of
بنو النذير
from Medina took place in Rabi al-Awwal 4 after Hijri. It is therefore probable that the section which contains the final warning to the Jews, O you who have been granted the book, do believe in what we have now revealed, which confirms the revelation which you already possess. Do this before we alter countenances, turning them backwards.
Surah النساء
447 was revealed shortly before their expulsion. In the same way, the permission to do
تيمم,
symbolic ablution attained through wiping the face and hands with clean earth in place of ablution was granted on the occasion of the battle of Banu al-Mustalik in 5 after Hijri. The section which deals with
تيمم,
may therefore be taken as belonging to this period. See verses 43. Background and subject matter. Let us now survey briefly the situation in order to appreciate more fully the contents of this surah. The tasks before the Prophet, peace be upon him, at this time may be classified into 3 broad categories. First, to develop the newly organized Islamic society which had come into being in and around Medina as a result of the influx of believers, a society which was attempting to give effect to new principles in the moral, social, economic, and political spheres of life, and to do away with the old ways and practices of the days of ignorance, Jahiliyyah. Second, to counter the fierce opposition of the polytheists, Jewish tribes, and the hypocrites. Third, to spread the message of Islam in the face of hostility from these opposing forces and to win over the minds and hearts of the people. The various discourses revealed by God at this time deal with these different problems. The Islamic society at this juncture thus required additional directives to those which it had received earlier and which are embodied in Surah Al-Baqarah. In the discourses of this surah, the Muslims are told in much greater detail how to mold their collective life in accordance with the dictates of Islam. They are told how to organize their family life. Regulations are laid down with respect to marriage, prohibiting union with certain categories of relatives. The pattern of relationships between men and women is enunciated. The rights of orphans are clearly defined. Laws for the distribution of inheritance are promulgated. Directives are issued to ensure that economic activities continue to be based on sound moral principles. Muslims are taught what measures to adopt to solve their family disputes. The foundations of a penal code are laid. The drinking of intoxicants is prohibited. Fresh directives are given to ensure purity of the heart as well as righteousness of conduct. Muslims are clearly told what man's attitude should be towards God and towards His creatures. Instructions are given to establish discipline within the Islamic body politic. The moral and religious attitude of the people of the book is criticized, thus warning the Muslims against following in the footsteps of the religious communities which preceded them. Likewise, the conduct of the hypocrites is criticized, thereby highlighting the requirements of true faith and clearly distinguishing the characteristics of true faith from those of hypocrisy. The struggle waged by the forces opposed to the Islamic reform movement assumed even more menacing proportions after the Battle of Uhud. The reverse suffered by the Muslims in that battle had infused a new spirit into the pagan Arab tribes, the neighboring Jews, and also the hypocrites, who were an integral part of the Islamic body politic. The result was that the Muslims found themselves confronted by dangers from all sides. In such a circumstance, God urged the Muslims to meet these dangers bravely. He revealed inspiring passages and gave them instructions how to conduct themselves when faced with armed conflict. In Medina, the hypocrites and those of weak faith were disseminating all kinds of rumors so as to demoralize the Muslims. To counteract this, the Muslims were asked to pass on all such rumors to responsible people, who were to prevent their further dissemination unless and until they could be confirmed after proper investigations. Let us take another case occasioned by these circumstances. The Muslims often had to go on military expeditions, sometimes with and sometimes without the Prophet, peace be upon him, and they often traveled by routes where water was unavailable. They were now told that it was permissible for them to resort to
tayammum,
symbolic ablution attained through wiping the face and hands with clean earth in place of both major and minor washing. Likewise, permission was granted to shorten prayers while traveling, and instructions were given on how to perform prayers when danger was imminent. At that time, some Muslims lived outside the Islamic realm and were scattered throughout Arabia, living in the midst of pagan tribes. At times they were drawn into the orbit of war and thus suffered harm. This had become a matter of great anxiety for the Muslims, and the Islamic community was instructed in how to deal with it. At the same time, Muslims living in the midst of non-Muslim tribes were urged to migrate to Medina, the Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam. The attitude of one Jewish tribe in particular
Banu an-Nazir,
had become particularly hostile. Its people blatantly violated the agreements they had concluded with the Muslims and identified openly with the enemies of Islam by giving them support. They engaged in conspiracies and machinations against the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his followers even within the city of Medina. In this surah, their conduct is severely criticized and they are given a final warning in categorical terms. After this warning, they were expelled from Medina. The hypocrites comprised several groups, each of which behaved in a different manner so that it was difficult for the Muslims to decide how to deal with them. In this surah, the hypocrites are classified into separate categories, and the Muslims are told what treatment should be accorded to each group. They are also told what attitude they should adopt towards the neutral tribes which had entered into agreements with them. Most important of all, the Muslims are made to realize the necessity of developing blameless moral character, for if they were to triumph in their struggle, then this triumph would come about primarily through moral excellence. The Muslims are urged, therefore, to cultivate the highest moral qualities and are reproached severely for any past lapses. Another aspect of religious duty for the Muslims, preaching their faith and inviting people to share it with them, is also stressed. In addition to elaborating a blueprint for the moral and social reform envisaged by Islam in contradistinction to non-heavenly doctrines, Jahiliyyah, the surah criticizes the erroneous religious concepts and the moral perversion and corruption of the Jews, Christians, and polytheists, and invites each of them to embrace Islam.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim.
In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate.
يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به الأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا.
O men, fear your Lord who created you from a single being, and out of it created its mate, and out of the two spread many men and women. Fear Allah in whose name you plead for rights, and heed the ties of kinship. Surely Allah is ever watchful over you. And out of the two spread many men and women. What are the mutual rights of human beings? What are the principles on which a sound and stable family life can be established are questions that are discussed a little further on in this surah. As an appropriate introduction to the subject, the surah opens by exhorting the believers to fear God and to avoid courting His displeasure, and by urging them to recognize that all human beings have sprung from the same root, and that all of them are, therefore, of one another's flesh and blood. The expression, who created you from a single being, nafs, indicates that the creation of the human species began with the creation of one individual. At another place, the Quran specifies that the one person from whom the human race spread in the world was Adam. For Adam being the progenitor of mankind, see Towards Understanding the Quran, Surah 2, verses 31, and Surah Al-Araf 7:11. The details how out of that being its mate was created are not known to us. The explanation which is generally given by the commentators of the Quran, and which is also found in the Bible, is that Eve was created out of a rib of Adam. The Talmud is even more detailed in it, that it states that Eve was created out of Adam's 13th rib on the left side. The Quran, however, is silent on the matter, and the tradition which is adduced in support of this statement does not mean what is often thought to be. It is thus better that we leave the matter in the same state of ambiguity in which it was left by God, rather than waste our time trying to determine in detail the actual process of the creation of man's mate.
وآتوا اليتامى أموالهم ولا تتبدلوا الخبيث بالطيب ولا تأكلوا أموالهم إلى أموالكم إنه كان حوبا كبيرا.
Give orphans their property, and do not exchange the bad for the good. And do not eat up their property by mixing it with your own. This surely is a mighty sin. Give orphans their property. God directs the guardians of the orphans to spend out of the latter's property while they are still minors, and to restore it to them when they attain majority. And do not exchange the bad for the good. The order not to exchange the bad for the good has several meanings. On the one hand, it means that one should not replace honest by dishonest living. At the same time, it also means that one should not exchange one's own property, which is of little value, for the more valuable property of the orphans.
وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَلَّا تَعُولُوا.
If you fear that you might not treat the orphans justly, then marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. If you fear that you will not be able to treat them justly, then marry only 1. Or marry from among those whom your right hands possess. This will make it more likely that you will avoid injustice. Then marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. Commentators have explained this in the following ways. 1. There is the view of Aisha, who says that men tended to marry orphan girls who were under their guardianship out of consideration for either their property, beauty, or because they thought they would be able to treat them according to their whims, as they had no one to protect them.
After marriage, such men sometimes committed excesses against these girls. It is in this context that the Muslims are told that if they fear they will not be able to do justice to the orphan girls, then they should marry other girls whom they like. This interpretation seems to be supported by verse 127 of this surah. 2. The second view is that of Ibn Abbas and his disciple Ikrimah, who expressed the opinion that in the Jahiliyyah period there was no limit on the number of wives a man could take. The result was that a man sometimes married as many as 10 women, and when expenses increased because of a large family, he encroached on the rights either of his orphan nephews or other relatives. It was in this context that God fixed the limit of 4 wives and instructed the Muslims that they may marry up to 4 wives, providing they possess the capacity to treat them equitably. 3. Sa'id bin Jubair Qatada and some other commentators say that while the Arabs of the Jahiliyyah period did not approve of subjecting orphans to wrong, they had no concept of justice and equity with regard to women. They married as many women as they wanted and then subjected them to injustice and oppression. It is in this context that people are told if they fear perpetrating wrongs on orphans, they ought to be equally worried about perpetrating them on women. In the first place, they should never marry more than 4, and of those 4, they should marry only as many as they can treat fairly. Each of the 3 interpretations is plausible, and all 3 may possibly be correct. Moreover, the verse could also mean that if a person does not find himself able to treat orphans in a fair manner, then he might as well marry the women who are looking after those orphans.
If you fear that you will not be able to treat them justly, then marry only one.
Muslim jurists are agreed that according to this verse, the maximum number of wives has been fixed at 4. This conclusion is also supported by traditions. It is reported that when Ghailan, the chief of Taif, embraced Islam, he had 9 wives. The Prophet, peace be upon him, ordered him to keep only 4 wives and divorce the rest. Another person, Nawfal bin Muawiyah, had 5 wives. The Prophet, peace be upon him, ordered him to divorce one of them. For the relevant traditions, see the comments of Ibn Kathir and Qurtubi on this verse. This verse stipulates that marrying more wives than one is permissible on the condition that one treats his wives equitably. A person who avails himself of this permission granted by God to have a plurality of wives and disregards the condition laid down by God to treat them equitably has not acted in good faith with God. In case there are complaints from wives that they are not being treated equitably, the Islamic State has the right to intervene and redress such grievances. Some people who have been overwhelmed and overawed by the Christianized outlook of Westerners have tried to prove that the real aim of the Quran was to put an end to polygamy, which, in their opinion, is intrinsically evil. Since it was widely practiced at that time, however, Islam confined itself to placing restrictions on it. Such arguments only show the mental slavery to which these people have succumbed. That polygamy is an evil per se is an unacceptable proposition, for under certain conditions it becomes a moral and social necessity. If polygamy is totally prohibited, men who cannot remain satisfied with only one wife will look outside the bounds of matrimonial life and create sexual anarchy and corruption. This is likely to cause much greater harm than polygamy to the moral and social order. For this reason, the Quran has allowed those who feel the need for it to resort to polygamy. Those who consider it an evil in itself may certainly denounce it in disregard of the Quran and may even argue for its abolition. But they have no right to attribute such a view to the Quran, for it has expressed its permission of polygamy in quite categorical terms. Indeed, there is not the slightest hint in the Quran that could justify the conclusion that it advocates abolition of polygamy.
Or marry from among those whom your right hands possess.
This expression denotes slave girls, for instance, female captives of war who are distributed by the state among individuals. The purpose of this verse is to tell men that if their financial circumstances do not permit them to support a free woman as their wife, then they may marry a slave girl, See verse 25 below. If they consider it necessary to have more than one wife, and it would be difficult for them to treat their free wives equitably, they may resort to slave girls, for here the burden of obligations is lighter by comparison. For further injunctions regarding slave girls, see N44 below.
وآتوا النساء صدقاتهن نحلة فإن طبن لكم عن شيء منه نفسا فكلوه هنيئا مريئا.
Give women their bridal due in good cheer, considering it a duty. But if they willingly remit any part of it, consume it with good pleasure. But if they willingly remit any part of it, consume it with good pleasure.
In the opinion of Umar and SURAH, if a woman gives up either the whole or a part of the bridal due, meher, in favor of her husband and later reclaims it from him, then he is bound to pay it. The claim on the woman's part would be tantamount to her unwillingness to remit either the whole or a part of the bridal due.
ولا تؤتوا السفهاء أموالكم التي جعل الله لكم قياما وارزقوهم فيها واكسوهم وقولوا لهم قولا معروفا.
Do not entrust your properties, which Allah has made a means of support for you, to the weak of understanding, but maintain and clothe them out of it, and say to them a kind word of admonition.
This verse covers a very wide spectrum of meaning. It emphasizes to the community of believers that wealth is one of the main supports of human life. It should not be left, therefore, at the mercy of those who are incompetent to handle it properly. By misusing wealth, such people might destroy the basis of social and economic life and wreck the moral foundations of human society. The right to private property is not so absolute. If a person is incapable of exercising this right properly, and if he might cause grave social harm by wanton expenditure, then his right may be forfeited. The necessities of such a person's life should always be provided for. But so far as the exercise of his proprietary rights is concerned, due restrictions should be placed on it in order that the owner is restrained from spending his resources in brazen disregard of the dictates of morality, collective welfare, and economic interests of the community. According to the directive embodied in the verse, anyone who entrusts his property to someone else's care should satisfy himself that the latter is capable of making good use of it. At a higher level, it is incumbent upon an Islamic state to take over the management of the properties of those who either lack totally the capacity for good management or cause social damage by misuse. In such cases, the state is responsible for providing these people with their livelihood.